And hello to the Thursday morning group. Sorry I can't be with you in person, but glad that I can at least talk virtually. Though it is kind of weird to think about that. Anyway, what a blessing. Well, bless her heart. God bless you. I mean, we use the word bless and blessings so much that they seem to lose their power. A lot of influencers are #blessed when they have, reveal their new perfect home or latest shopping haul. We ask God to bless somebody when we sneeze. And even in my house growing up, sometimes if somebody passed gas, instead of saying like, what happened, my dad would always ask like, who blessed us? But in the Bible, a blessing is more than just a nice phrase that we sprinkle here and there. The Hebrew word bless in Genesis is barak, which means to kneel in submission before God. The word for blessing is barakah, which means a benediction of praise or thanks that's directed towards God. So when God blessed Abraham and called him to be a blessing in Genesis 12, he gave him a really powerful calling. Abraham's life would be directing other people to praise and thank God, not just in his generation, but for thousands of generations and descendants to come. So even today, when we're blessing our meals, we are inviting the presence of God to come and join us as we eat together. So for our final week, we're going to wrap up with 3 generations of Abraham's family, with the offspring of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, our patriarchs. We'll hear some Joseph too. We've seen them struggle. We've seen them overcome. We've seen God's faithfulness to Abraham and his descendants throughout the generations, and there's still plenty more to come. We still have our favorite question of the study: why does our perfect God use so many imperfect people to bring about his perfect plan? But today we're going to adjust our view just a little bit and think about the promises and blessings that God has given to Abraham and his family. A lot of times what might be a blessing doesn't really look like something that we consider to be a blessing. And sometimes God puts us in extraordinary difficult places to fulfill the promises and the calling that he has put on our lives. So today's adventure, we are going to start again with Abraham, and he is still Abram at this point. And as we've seen, he has a very close relationship with God. He talks to God. He speaks with him face to face. And even though Abram and Sarai they're in their later years with no biological children, God gives him this promise in Genesis 12:1. The Lord said, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." So here, God gives Abram a fourfold blessing. First, he blesses Abram himself. God himself is blessing him, will make Abram's name great, and make him a blessing to others. Second, he's blessing the land, which is, I have a little map here. You can kind of see it's, so in ancient times, it's like here, it's like what would be modern day Israel, and then a little bit of Syria. So that is the land that God has given to Abram. And many of his descendants are still there today. Third, he's blessing Abram's offspring, and they don't even exist. He doesn't even have a single child at this time. And then finally, God tells him, like, all people on earth are going to be blessed through you. So the blessing is for the humanity itself. So what does Abram do in response to this powerful blessing from God? He just takes the next step. He goes to Canaan with his nephew Lot, his wife Sarai, all their possessions. If I were given this kind of a blessing, I would skip straight to the end. My mind is going to spiral. We're going to go down rabbit trails. What does this mean? Why me, God? I don't know that I can do this. But Abram doesn't. He doesn't pontificate. He doesn't spiral. He doesn't, he trusts God. He listens to God. He believes him, and he leaves it all in God's hands. So what does God do in response? He blesses Abram and his obedience even more. In Genesis 15, which we read last week, Abram's blessing gets a little bit more specific. We know he's going to have a biological child, and from this child, all the nations in the world are going to be blessed. And how does Abram respond? In Genesis 15:6, Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. So a couple chapters later in Genesis 17, God makes another covenant with Abram. Starting in verse 2, I will make my covenant between me and you and will greatly increase your numbers. Abram fell face down, and God said to him, as for me, this is my covenant with you. You will be the father of many nations. No longer will you be called Abram. Your name will be, which is like a father, your name will be Abraham, which is the father of many nations, which is literally what he was. For I've made you a father of many nations. I will make you very fruitful. I will make nations of you. Kings will come from you. I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant between me and you and your descendants after you for the generations to come, to be your God and the God of your descendants after you. The whole land of Canaan, where you now reside as a foreigner, I will give as an everlasting possession to you and your descendants after you, and I will be their God. Then God said to Abraham, as for you, you must keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you for generations to come. So each of these three covenants, they get increasingly personal. First, Abraham is told he's going to be in a great nation or become a great nation. Then it's more specific. He knows he's going to be the father of many nations through his own biological son. Then he knows that he's going to get a new name, Abraham. He's going to get specific possession of the land. And even his wife Sarah gets the promise that she's going to be the mother of these many nations. And again, we see all four components of the initial blessing. Abraham himself, the land, the offspring, and the future nations. But now we can we get more details and we can see the fruit of Abraham's trust. And I think the same principle really applies in our own lives too. The more that we walk with God, the more we trust him, believe him, and the deeper our relationship with God is going to grow. And even though we're blessed by this close relationship with God, the blessing isn't just for us and our own benefit. I mean, even though that is pretty amazing, but it's also, as we spend more time with God, we become more like him. We are also blessing other people around us. We're blessing the land around us. And ultimately, we're blessing, potentially all the nations of the world. But God's blessings and our perceptions of blessings do not always line up. Sometimes we face obstacles before we receive the promises of God. Sometimes we don't even receive all the promises in our lifetime. Like Abraham's blessings were for him, but also his descendants, and they're still going on today. And even with something like the land, he's promised the land of Canaan. There are people living in Canaan, the Canaanites. Like the land, it's not like this empty, vast wasteland. And it takes decades before his descendants are actually taking hold of that. But Abraham is not looking at the obstacles before him. Instead, he's trusting in God. And this trust is put to the test in Genesis 22. And this is starting in verse 1. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Then God said, take your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. So Abraham waited decades for his promised son. But he trusts God for him, and God has delivered. And then God tells him this. Most of us, if God told me to sacrifice my kids, I would assume I'm losing my mind and completely ignore this. But Abraham trusted God. The chapter before this one, Sarah, Abraham did have another son, Ishmael, but Sarah had already sent him and his mother into the wilderness. So he has this promise from God, but with Isaac is his only son right now. There's no plan B. This is the one that God promised. But again, Abraham is trusting God more than he trusts in the blessings that God has given him. He's trusting the giver more than the gifts. And so he takes Isaac into the wilderness to sacrifice him because he doesn't want anything to hold him back from God and what God has for him. And this is a little snippet of their conversation in verse 7 of chapter 22. Isaac spoke up and said to his father, Abraham, Father? Yes, my son, Abraham replied. The fire and wood are here, Isaac said, but where's the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the two of them went on together. So I just imagine what's going through Abraham's head at this point, or Isaac's head. Do we think that they told Sarah about any of this? I'm sure they did not, because no mother is going to be sure, take my son up and my only son. At this point, she's probably over 100 years old, and sacrifice him. No. So I would assume Sarah is left in the dark, and she'd think her husband had gone totally bonkers. But Abraham trusted God, and in verse 9, when they reached the place God told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand, took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." So just imagine the relief that Abraham and probably Isaac even more so are feeling at this moment. Just after this, they find a ram in the thicket and they name him for the spot. The Lord will provide, because that's where God provided the sacrifice for them. Verse 15, Abraham gets another promise from the Lord. The angel called to him from heaven a second time and said, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, because you've done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me." So we get another, God's reaffirming this blessing again. Abraham now, his land, his descendants, all the nations on earth because of this obedience. I don't think that God actually had any intention of having Abraham murder his son, but I think this is just a really striking illustration of what true faith looks like. No matter what trials we might encounter, when we fix our eyes on God, we're developing this beautiful faith that can withstand the test of time. 1 Peter 1, 6 through 8 says, "In all this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you may have had to suffer in grief all kinds of trials. These have come so that the proven genuineness of your faith, of greater worth than gold, which perishes even though refined by fire, may result in praise, glory, and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed." So if you're going through periods of trials or grief or suffering right now, take heart, because these moments of pain God is using them to put you exactly where he needs you to be, to refine you and just to shape you into the person that he's called and created you to be. God kept his promise to Abraham, his son Isaac, and Abraham's son Isaac has twin sons, Jacob and Esau. Last week we looked at their tumultuous relationship where Esau sold his birthright and blessing to Jacob for a bowl of stew, and when he realized the consequences of what he had done, he tried to kill his brother. So Jacob fled to his uncle Laban's house, where he married his two cousins, Leah and Rachel. During these years, Jacob underwent some extreme trials that helped to prove his faith genuine. And he was deceived by his uncle Laban. He married Leah when he was under the impression he was going to marry Rachel, and winds up working twice as long as he imagined. He stayed with them longer, but after a while, things are starting to get a little tense. So God told Jacob in Genesis 31:3, "Go back to the land of your fathers, to your relatives, and I will be with you." So Jacob has another tangle with Laban, but he leaves with his wives, a lot of cattle, and his children, but he also knows going home means he has to confront the brother who was dead set on killing him 20 years earlier. So when they were last together, Jacob is a schemer. He's planning, he's doing whatever he can, any kind of trickery to get his brother's birthright and blessing. But now he knows that he can't approach Esau on his own strength. So he humbles himself before the Lord. And he also claims the generational blessing that God had given his grandfather Abraham. Genesis 32:9, Jacob prayed, "Oh God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, Lord, you who said to me, 'Go back to your country and your relatives, and I will make you prosper.' I am unworthy of all of the kindness and faithfulness you have shown to your servant. I had only my staff when I crossed this Jordan, but now I have become two camps. Save me, I pray, from the hand of my brother Esau, for I'm afraid he will come and attack me, and also the mothers with their children. But you have said, I will surely make you prosper and will make your descendants like the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted." So I think it's really important to see that God's blessing for Abraham is still going strong 2 generations later. But Jacob actually takes things to the next level. So he's camped out, he's ready to meet his brother again. He sends along his big delegation of cows and bulls and servants to try to give really great gifts to make his brother happy. He also sends his wives, his maids, his 11 sons ahead. So he gets this rare night alone. And In Genesis 32:24, he's left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let go of me, for it's daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel." And Israel means God perseveres, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome. And Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." So imagine, I can't even imagine, because I thought Abraham was pretty bold when he is talking with God and kind of negotiating for him to spare Sodom and Gomorrah if he can find, just even 10 righteous people. But I always envisioned that conversation to be kind of civilized, whereas Jacob is like full on wrestling with God himself all night long in order to get another blessing. This is a really extreme contrast because you have his brother Esau, who just sold his blessing for a bowl of soup. And Jacob, on the other hand, is not going to let anything hold him back from God's blessing on his life. I still do. I always feel bad for like the siblings in the Bible who like seem like they get the short end, like Esau. And especially like if you consider Romans 9:13, and this is the Amplified Bible, "As it is written and forever remains, Jacob I loved," which means like chose or protected, blessed. "But Esau I hated," which doesn't mean actually hate, but just held in disregard compared to Jacob. But I think God knows the condition of our hearts. Like Jacob was deceitful. He definitely had flaws. He was not, he showed extreme favoritism as a husband and as a parent, but he wasn't going to let anything hold him back to claim the blessings that God had on his life. Whereas Esau didn't really care, and he was just only concerned with the here and the now. But when the two brothers reunite after Jacob spends this night wrestling with God, they have this glorious reunion in Genesis 33:4. "But Esau ran to meet Jacob and embraced him. He threw his arms around his neck and kissed him, and they wept." So God has worked in both of their hearts, and they have this sweet moment of forgiveness and reconciliation. And Jacob brought Esau these gifts, but Esau didn't even want them. Verse 8, Esau asked, "What's the meaning of these flocks and herds that I met?" "To find favor in your eyes, my lord," he said. But Jacob said, "I already have plenty, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself." "No, please," said Jacob. "If I have found favor in your eyes, accept this gift from me. For to see your face is like seeing the face of God, now that you have received me favorably. Please accept the present that was brought to you, for God has been gracious to me, and I have all I need." And because Jacob insisted, Esau accepted it. So the two brothers end up going their separate ways after this reunion, but I do love that they still go back when Isaac finally does pass away at the ripe old age of 180 years old. The two brothers come back together to bury their father together. So Jacob he's gotten the blessing, he has the birthright, he is now the patriarch of this family. And he has 12 sons, including Joseph, who is his very favorite. And you would think that he would know that favoritism as a parent is not going to end well, as is the case with him and his brother, but he does not. He loves Joseph, who's the son of his favorite wife, Rachel, and he gets this special coat. And then Joseph, in the way that little brothers do, brags to his older brothers about this dream that God gave him where everyone is bowing down to him. And as the older brothers are obviously not very happy about this, so they, again, another theme of the family, they decide to kill him. But Reuben, who's the oldest, intervenes, and instead of killing him, they sell him into slavery, but they tell Jacob that his favorite son Joseph has died. So the next several years of Joseph's life seem pretty awful from our perspective, but God's hand and his blessing are still on his life. Joseph is objectively really attractive, really intelligent, and he catches the attention of his boss Potiphar's wife. She tries to sleep with him, but when he ignores her advances, she gets him fired and thrown into prison. But God is still with Joseph. In prison, and this is Genesis 39:21, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. So one day in prison, two prisoners, a cupbearer and a baker, who are working for Pharaoh's household come in and they tell Joseph about some dreams that they're having. God has given Joseph the ability to interpret both of them accurately. He tells the baker, this dream means that in 3 days, your head's on the chopping block. But the cupbearer, he says, in 3 days, you're going to be back in Pharaoh's house. But when you go back there, do not forget me. Like, tell Pharaoh all about me. So both of those things end up happening. But the cupbearer totally forgets about Joseph for over 2 years. So he's still hanging out in prison. But God still remembers and blesses Joseph. So finally, Pharaoh starts having his own dreams, and the cupbearer remembers Joseph, and so they bring him up from prison to Pharaoh. God gives Joseph the ability to interpret Pharaoh's dreams, and Pharaoh is so impressed that he immediately puts Joseph in charge of all of Egypt. He gets the royal signet ring, he gets the robes, he gets all of the authority. And so this happy redemption story is what we usually think of when we think of blessing, like you're down in the dumps, but then you're better. But God is blessing Joseph the whole way through, and he's using every single piece of this journey, even the really unfortunate ones, to make it happen. God is blessing Joseph when he's in prison, and he's using those years where he's running the prison and running a household beforehand to prepare him to run the entire nation. I mean, without that training, he probably wouldn't have had the same kind of wisdom and experience to know what to do. In this instance, we can see things working together for a higher purpose, but sometimes we can't even begin to understand what God is doing or why. But that doesn't mean that we don't still have the blessing or the favor of the Lord. One of my mom's favorite sayings was that she was God's favorite. And in a sense, she's right, because all of us are God's favorites. Hooray! But so often when she would talk about this favoritism, they were in really little tiny feel-good ways. She was the favorite when she'd pray for a good parking spot and get one right in the front, or when we would go skiing. She was from Colorado. We would go skiing once a year, and that year she would always pray for the weather, and that was the week where we'd get fresh snow and it was beautiful. Or when she'd go to TJ Maxx. I mean, I still do this with my kids in the car. We always pray whenever I go shopping. I always pray that we don't spend money that we don't need to spend, but she would always pray for a good bargain, and she would they'd have the one dress in her size 70% off, and all of these great things would happen. And I think it can be easy to think about God's blessings like that, and the little winks from heaven, and that is true. But this perspective isn't really a comprehensive picture of what God's blessings can actually entail. I mean, probably the most quoted area when we think of blessings in the Bible, it comes from the Beatitudes in Matthew 5, where Jesus kind of turns that paradigm on its head. The Greek word for the blessing here is makarios, which means blessed or fortunate, and the Hebrew equivalent is ashrei, which means the good life. So according to Jesus in Matthew 5, we're living the good life and we're flourishing when we are poor in spirit, for then ours is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. For when we're being persecuted, we're hungering or thirsting for righteousness, when we're mourning, when we're meek. In those moments, that's when the presence and the power of God is filling us in extraordinary ways. And he's meeting us where we are, even in those depths. I think sometimes, especially in those depths, is when we really can experience the fullness of the blessing and the power of his presence. If Joseph hadn't been sold into slavery, he never would have made it to Egypt in the first place, and he wouldn't have been able to ultimately save his entire family. If he hadn't been falsely accused by Potiphar's wife, he wouldn't have been in prison, and he would never have met the cupbearer of Pharaoh. So years later, Joseph's initial dreams do come true. God's given him extraordinary wisdom. There's a famine in the land and in Canaan, but under Joseph's leadership, Egypt is just flourishing. So Jacob's family in Canaan is struggling, so he sends his sons so they can buy grain. Joseph immediately recognizes his brothers, but they have no idea who he is, and he helps them, but doesn't really reveal himself. So they, go back to Canaan, run out of grain again, come back to Egypt, and there's a little more back and forth, and finally Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. In Genesis 45:1, Joseph could no longer control himself before all of his attendants, and he cried out, "Have everyone leave my presence." So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph repeatedly tells his brothers how he has forgiven them. And then in verse 5, now don't be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here, but God. So Joseph recognizes the blessings of God's mighty hand on his life. Even though he had some really difficult years, God was with him and just weaving together this beautiful story that would ultimately redeem his family. He later reunites with his father, who the brothers bring to Egypt, and as Israel/Jacob dies, he blesses all 12 of his sons and Joseph's 2 sons as well. After Jacob dies, the brothers are fearing that Joseph might change his mind and enact revenge, but he doesn't. In Genesis 50, 19-21, Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. So you have to love this redemptive arc, because Joseph at this point has all of the worldly blessings, but he doesn't take the place of God. He's not overstepping. He understands his place. He's still humble. He's also standing on the promises of God and taking hold of the generational blessings of those who came before him. So as we say goodbye now to the patriarchs and their families, remember to hold fast to the promises and blessings that God has placed on your life. He has a tremendous plan and calling for you, and you are God's favorite, and you are blessed. So don't be discouraged when this calling or blessing doesn't line up with your expectations of what you think God's promises should look like, because he is still working a great work in you. There is also, when we think about blessings, there's power in words. And so remember to speak God's blessings over yourself, your family, your friends, your children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. I think for me, it is the hardest to speak blessings over myself. But I think one of the greatest legacies that my mother gave to us, which she received from her own mother, is just the power to speak positive truths and blessings over yourself, your kids, your husband. Words are power, words are spirit. And she was also very adamant about not talking negatively about, she did like a good gossip session like the rest of us, but she never would speak negatively about like my father or her kids. It was always just trying to speak with an attitude of blessing. She was not blind to our shortcomings. She was not a pushover, but just wanted to make sure that we were living in the truth and speaking the truth of God into our own lives and into our own families. So through Christ, we are all part of this powerful spiritual legacy that spans through the generations. We are children of God. We have been blessed to be blessings. So now it's time that we go own it.